Alliance AO41702 is a phase 3 clinical trial for older adults who have not previously received therapy for CLL. The initial age cutoff for the study was 70, but a later amendment allowed patients age 65 and older. So the study primarily is enrolling an older patient population. The reason for this study is we've been using BTK inhibitors, and specifically one BTK inhibitor called ibrutinib, as an initial therapy for CLL for many years now. And ibrutinib can be given either alone or in combination with an anti-CD20 antibody, obinutuzumab. When given in this manner, ibrutinib has to be continued until disease progression or until it is not tolerated anymore, because we don't see a lot of undetectable minimal residual disease responses. So this study was designed to see whether the addition of the BCL2 inhibitor venetoclax to ibrutinib plus obinutuzumab would allow for a successful discontinuation and therefore potentially allow for a prolonged progression-free survival versus ibrutinib plus obinutuzumab given as the doublet. So patients in this trial were randomly assigned to either ibrutinib obinutuzumab or IO, or ibrutinib venetoclax obinutuzumab or IVO. All patients continued their primary therapy for 14 cycles, with the obinutuzumab being given for the first 6 cycles like a standard. And then at the end of the 14 cycles, everybody underwent a response evaluation with CAT scans and a bone marrow biopsy. The patients who were in the IO arm all continued ibrutinib indefinitely. The patients on the IVO arm, if they had an undetectable minimal residual disease in the bone marrow and a complete response, they went off the venetoclax and the ibrutinib. If they had any other response, they went off the venetoclax but continued the ibrutinib indefinitely. The reason we're actually presenting these data today, or at ASCO this year, is because the study actually met its futility endpoint, meaning that at one of the interim analyses, we found that IVO could not be superior to IO in terms of progression-free survival. So those are the data that we'll be presenting, showing that with a median follow-up of a little bit over a year, the progression-free survival is actually very similar between the two arms, and unfortunately, IVO will not be able to surpass IO in terms of PFS. Unfortunately, this trial was very much impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we actually saw an imbalance in the deaths on this study, where more patients on the IVO arm died of COVID compared to the IO arm. We had 11 patients on the IO arm die of COVID and 19 patients on the IVO arm die of COVID. So in addition to showing our primary PFS and overall survival data, we actually censored the patients who died of COVID to see what the impact of COVID deaths, at least, were on the outcomes. And interestingly, we saw that once we eliminated the COVID deaths, we actually see that now IVO actually does look still very similar to IO, but the Kaplan-Meier curves actually flip, and now IVO is a little bit superior to IO, not statistically different, but I think of interest given the findings with the whole group. So I think, what this tells us is that we really are going to need long-term follow-up on this study to see whether some patients do benefit from the triplet regimen with discontinuation of therapy versus the doublet. We actually saw a very high rate of undetectable minimal residual disease on this study. Over 85% of patients on the IVO arm had undetectable MRD in their bone marrow, and a large number of patients also had a complete response, therefore meaning that a lot of patients on the IVO arm actually have discontinued treatment. And we know that, ibrutinib given over prolonged periods of time can have side effects associated with it that might make people discontinue therapy early. And so I think it's going to be really critical to follow this study for years to come so we can see whether there are some advantages in terms of, potentially progression-free survival, but at least in terms of safety and survival, that may make it beneficial for some patients to receive IVO as opposed to IO.